The man who was shot survived. His daughter, who was shot beside him, also survived. The woman who allegedly paid for the attack spent 11 days in jail. The people who actually pulled the trigger were never prominently named in any public report I could find. And the crime that started everything, the abuse that allegedly happened inside that house, before the guns, before the arrest, before the cameras, was investigated so quietly that, as far as the public record shows, no one was ever charged for it. A father allegedly abused his own daughter for an extended period of time. 2 people were hired to kill him because of it. Both targets survived. And the man at the center of it, the one person whose alleged conduct set the entire chain of events in motion, walked away from this story in better legal shape than almost everyone else involved. I have been looking at this case for weeks, and that is the detail I cannot get past. Not the shooting, not the arrest. The silence around the one question that should have been the loudest. My name is Harrison Cross, and this is the Blackout Tapes. Tonight, we are looking at a case from Canindé, a small municipality deep in the interior of Ceará, one of Brazil's northeastern states. Most people outside Brazil have never heard of it. It is known primarily as a pilgrimage city. Hundreds of thousands of Catholic devotees travel there every year to honor St. Francis of Assisi. What happened there in the summer of 2021 has nothing to do with devotion, and everything to do with what gets buried inside a household when the institutions meant to protect people fail to show up. The events I'm going to walk you through took place in 2021, and they involve 3 central figures: Jaelson Camelo de Oliveira, his companion Maria Aparecida Barroso, and a man identified in court records as Antonio Herelson da Silva Lopes. What began as a domestic situation, and I use that term knowing how inadequate it is, escalated into a contracted killing attempt, a public scandal, and a legal proceeding that remained unresolved in the sources available to me. This episode is my attempt to reconstruct what the documents show, where the documents fail, and why I think the gaps matter as much as the facts. To understand how this happened, we have to go back further than the shooting. Further than the arrest. We have to go back to what was allegedly happening inside a house in Canindé long before anyone called the police. Before I get into the events themselves, I want to make one thing clear about how this case has been covered, because it matters for how you hear everything that follows. This case became a minor media phenomenon in Brazil in the fall of 2021. It was covered by regional television affiliates, by major northeastern newspapers, and it later circulated widely in digital formats. Videos, threads, audio clips that collectively reached millions of people. I have reviewed several of those accounts. And I have to say, with respect to the people who produced them, some of that coverage was careless in ways that I think did real damage to the public understanding of what actually happened here. One example, a widely circulated account of this case, the kind you can find on Brazilian YouTube with more than 2 million views, describes Canindé as a city of approximately 880,000 people. The actual population of Canindé, according to the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics census data from 2022, is approximately 74,000. That is not a rounding error. That is an order of magnitude wrong, and I raise it not to embarrass anyone, but because I think it is symptomatic of something. When you get a basic, checkable fact that wrong, it tells you something about the relationship between the narrator and the place they are describing. Canindé is not a backdrop. It is not a setting chosen for atmosphere. It is a real community of real people, most of whom have nothing to do with this case, and treating it as a generic stage for moral horror, without even bothering to look up how many people live there, is a small cruelty that accumulates into something larger. It is how places and the people in them get reduced to the worst thing that ever happened inside their borders. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is try to tell you what the documents actually show. According to testimony gathered by the civil police of the state of Ceará, as reported by Diário do Nordeste and O Povo in late September and October of 2021, Maria Aparecida Barroso had been living for some period of time with the knowledge that her companion, Jaelson Camelo de Oliveira, had engaged in a sexual relationship with her daughter. The daughter was her child. Jaelson was the adult partner in the household. The precise timeline of when Maria Aparecida became aware of this, and through what means, is one of the central ambiguities of the case. Court records available in the public domain do not specify whether she was told directly, whether she witnessed something, or whether the information reached her through a third party. What the records do indicate is that the information, whenever and however it arrived, did not produce an immediate call to the police. And I want to be precise about why that matters, and why it does not mean what some coverage implied it meant. Maria Aparecida's legal defense introduced a parallel account of the household, that she herself had been subjected to sustained physical and psychological violence by Jaelson, and that the conditions of that violence had made any conventional exit from the relationship effectively impossible. She described threats. She described economic dependence. She described a situation in which the formal mechanisms of protection, the police, the courts, the social services infrastructure, were not options she felt she could access without catastrophic personal consequence. Now, Brazil has a specific legal framework designed for exactly this situation. The Maria da Penha law, enacted in 2006, is one of the most comprehensive domestic violence statutes in Latin America. It provides for protective orders, for safe housing referrals, for dedicated police units and judicial chambers that handle domestic violence cases. On paper, it is a serious piece of legislation. In practice, its application across Brazil is deeply uneven. In smaller municipalities in the interior of northeastern states, the infrastructure to implement it, the trained officers, the specialized courts, the shelter beds, the social workers, has historically been inconsistent at best and absent at worst. I cannot tell you with certainty what was or was not available to Maria Aparecida in Canindé in 2021. What I can tell you is that the conditions she described, isolation, economic dependence, fear of retaliation, distrust of institutional intervention, are not invented. They are documented features of the environment in which many women in similar situations find themselves, and they are precisely the conditions that the Maria da Penha law was designed to address, but does not always reach. That context does not excuse what happened next, but it is the context, and leaving it out makes the story false. There is a legal question sitting at the center of this case that almost none of the popular coverage addressed seriously, and I think it is the most important question in the entire file. Brazilian criminal law does not recognize incest as a standalone criminal offense. That is factually accurate, and several accounts of this case cited it as if it were the end of the analysis. It is not the end of the analysis. It is barely the beginning. The Brazilian Penal Code, as amended by Law 12,015 of 2009, criminalizes what it calls estupro de vulnerável, the sexual violation of a vulnerable person. That offense applies when the victim is under 14 years of age, or when the victim lacks the capacity to consent due to any cause, including coercion, threats, or conditions of dependence that compromise the voluntariness of the act. The law does not require physical force. It requires the absence of genuine, free consent. The relationship described in this case, between an adult man in a position of domestic authority and a woman who was his companion's daughter and who lived under his roof, raises obvious questions under that statute. Was she a minor at the time the relationship began or continued? Was her participation in any meaningful sense voluntary, given the power dynamics inside the household? Was she subject to any form of coercion, explicit or implicit? I do not know the answers to those questions. The public record does not give them to me. What I do know from the regional press coverage is that investigators were reportedly examining those possibilities during the inquiry phase. The civil police of Ceará did not treat the sexual dimension of the case as irrelevant or as legally settled. But here is what I cannot find in any source I reviewed: a formal charge against Jailson Camelo de Oliveira for anything he allegedly did before the shooting. Not an arrest, not an indictment, not a mention of a separate inquiry. The public record, as far as I can reconstruct it, shows 3 people formally charged in connection with the attack of June 29th. It does not clearly show the man who allegedly committed the underlying abuse facing any equivalent legal consequence for that abuse. That asymmetry is, to me, the most disturbing feature of this entire case, and I think it explains, without justifying, a great deal of what came after. The shooting happened at the entrance of the residence on the evening of June 29th, 2021. Jailson Camelo de Oliveira and his daughter were shot at the threshold of their home. Both survived. The police inquiry that followed identified the attack as a contracted homicide attempt, what Brazilian criminal law refers to as tentativa de homicidio qualificado, a qualified attempted killing involving payment or promise of reward. The weapon or weapons used, the exact number of shots fired, and the precise medical condition of the 2 victims immediately after the attack are details the publicly available journalistic records reference, but do not specify with the precision that the original police files would contain. What regional press confirmed is that the father and daughter were taken to a medical facility and were described as having survived. The investigation proceeded quickly in its initial phase. By September 27, 2021, approximately 90 days after the shooting, Maria Aparecida Barroso had been arrested. Regional coverage attributed the arrest to evidence gathered during the inquiry, pointing to her role in commissioning the attack. Antonio Herilson da Silva Lopes was identified as the intermediary, the individual who allegedly connected Maria Aparecida with the people who physically carried out the shooting. According to reports citing police sources, Herilson provided testimony during the investigation, and it was at least partly through that testimony that the chain of events was reconstructed. This is where the documentary record becomes thinner, at exactly the moment the details become most consequential. The identity of the actual gunmen, the people who pulled the triggers, does not appear prominently in any regional press coverage I was able to review. Whether they were arrested, whether they testified, and what their testimony contained are questions I cannot answer from the available public record. I want to say something about that silence, because I do not think it is accidental. In the popular true crime ecosystem, the videos, the threads, the podcast episodes, the people who execute the violence in contracted killing cases are almost never the focus of sustained attention. They do not drive clicks. They do not generate the moral outrage or the complicated sympathy that the person who ordered the killing generates. So they disappear from the story. They become a logistical detail. 2 people were hired, 2 people showed up, 2 people fired. And then the narrative moves on to the more interesting characters. I think that is a serious ethical failure in how these stories get told, and I am aware that I am not entirely immune to it. The gunmen in this case were also people making choices, and those choices have legal consequences that the public record does not appear to have pursued with the same energy it directed at Maria Aparecida. 11 days after her arrest, on October 11, 2021, a judge granted Maria Aparecida Barroso provisional freedom. The legal justification, as reported by Diário do Nordeste, centered on the insufficiency of the grounds for continued pre-trial detention. Brazilian criminal procedure requires specific, individualized justification for pre-trial detention. A defense request for release based on the absence of adequate legal justification is a standard motion, and the judge apparently found it persuasive. That decision generated immediate controversy in the regional press and, based on available coverage, in the community. I understand the reaction, and I think the reaction itself tells you something important about what this case had become by that point, which is something different from what it started as. By October of 2021, the public narrative around Maria Aparecida Barroso was not simply the narrative of a woman who had ordered a killing. It had become, for a significant portion of the community, something closer to the narrative of a woman who had been failed by every institution available to her and had acted in the only way she felt she could. According to coverage in Diario do Nordeste, the period surrounding her arrest saw public demonstrations of solidarity outside the detention facility. People gathered to express support. The framing that organized that support was not that she had done nothing wrong. It was closer to the argument that the wrong she had done was comprehensible, that it was the downstream consequence of wrongs done to her that no one had adequately addressed. That is a morally complicated position for a community to take publicly, and I think it reflects something real. It reflects the gap, in this case, and in many cases like it, between what the law is designed to address and what it actually reaches when it encounters a woman with limited resources, no institutional support, and a household situation that has been deteriorating for a long time before anyone with authority notices. The legal system in Brazil, like the legal system in most places, is better at responding to acute, visible violence than it is at preventing or punishing the chronic, private violence that often precedes it. Maria Aparecida's alleged victimization was chronic and private. Jaelson's conduct was chronic and private. The shooting was acute and visible. And the acute, visible event is the one that produced the arrests, the charges, the court filings, and the public record I've been working from. The chronic, private events are the ones that produced mostly silence. The inquiry was formally concluded, and the defendants indicted on October 6th, 2021, 5 days before Maria Aparecida's release. From that point, the case entered the judicial phase of the Brazilian court system, a process that can extend for years before a trial is completed. The publicly available sources I reviewed do not contain documentation of a final verdict. This is not unusual. Brazilian criminal proceedings at the trial court level are often not covered in detail by regional press unless there is a significant new development, and the indexing of judicial archives in Ceará is not comprehensive enough to allow remote reconstruction of a complete case timeline from open sources. What I can say is this. As of the information available to me, 3 people were formally implicated in the criminal proceeding related to the shooting. Maria Aparecida Barroso faced charges related to commissioning the attack. Antonio Herelson da Silva Lopes faced charges related to his alleged role as intermediary. The legal status of the individuals who physically carried out the shooting, as I noted, is not documented in the sources I reviewed. And the question of whether Jailson Camelo de Oliveira faced any criminal investigation for the conduct that allegedly triggered the entire sequence of events is one that the public record, at least the portion of it accessible to me, does not answer. That last point is where I keep returning. The shooting of June 29th produced a documented legal response. The abuse that allegedly preceded it, the conduct that allegedly drove a woman to the point of paying for someone to be killed, appears to have produced something much closer to institutional silence. The spectacle ended. The arrests were made. The case moved through the machinery of the courts. And somewhere in that process, the question of what Jailson actually did and what accountability looked like for that seems to have been absorbed into the background noise of a story that everyone had already decided was about something else. I need to talk about the daughter one more time because she is the person this entire case pivots on, and she is also the person the case seems most determined to keep at the margins. Her name does not appear in the journalistic sources I reviewed. This is consistent with Brazilian legal protections for victims of sexual crimes, which prohibit the identification of alleged victims in media coverage, particularly when the crimes involve family members. That protection is legitimate and important, but it also means that the person whose experience is the moral and legal core of this case remains almost entirely without a documented voice in the public record. Television coverage from CETV aired on Globo's regional affiliate in Ceará and archived on the Globoplay platform included a report dated approximately September 30th, 2021, which apparently addressed testimony given by the father and the daughter regarding the nature of their relationship. I was not able to access the full content of that broadcast. What its existence tells me is that there was, at some point, at least a mediated version of their account in the public sphere. But what they said, under what conditions they said it, whether they had legal representation at the time, and how investigators interpreted their statements are things I cannot reconstruct. She is the center of this story, and she has no voice in it. That is not a neutral fact. It is a structural feature of how this case was investigated and reported, and I think it represents the most serious failure in the entire public record. The popular coverage of this case, the videos, the threads, the breathless recaps, treated her primarily as the explanation for what Maria Aparecida did. She was the reason, the motive, the backstory, not a person with standing in the proceedings, not a victim with a case of her own, but a narrative function, the thing that made the other thing make sense. My concern, and this is clearly my interpretation, not a documented finding, is that the same logic operated in the investigation itself. The question that should have been primary: what happened to her, who was responsible for it, and what legal accountability that responsibility produced, was subordinated to the question of what Maria Aparecida did in response to it. The response became the case. The original harm became the context. I cannot prove that. I do not have access to the full inquiry file, but the absence of any documented charge against Jaelson for the underlying abuse, set against the speed and thoroughness with which the contracting of the shooting was investigated, suggests a prioritization that I find very difficult to defend. Let me tell you what I think happened here, with full acknowledgement that this is my interpretation of incomplete information, and that I could be wrong. I think a woman lived for an extended period in a household where she was subjected to violence and coercion by her partner, and where her daughter was also being abused by that same partner. I think she reached a point where she concluded that the institutions available to her, legal, social, community, were not going to solve the problem. I think she made a decision that was illegal and that resulted in 2 people being shot. I think the investigation that followed was thorough in the ways that were easiest to be thorough, reconstructing the chain of the conspiracy, identifying the intermediary, making the arrest, filing the charges. And I think it was much less thorough in the ways that were harder, examining what happened before the shooting, asking what Jaelson's legal exposure was for his own alleged conduct, treating the daughter as a subject with standing rather than as a detail in someone else's file. My assumption is that the case will eventually produce a verdict, or has already produced one in a proceeding I cannot access. My assumption is also that the verdict, whatever it is, will be about the shooting, not about what preceded it, not about the conditions that produced it. The spectacle of the contracted killing is what generated the arrest warrants, the indictments, and the coverage. The slower, quieter violence that allegedly preceded it generated almost nothing visible in the public record. And the people who were harmed by that slower, quieter violence, particularly the daughter, who was both a victim of the abuse and a casualty of the shooting, will likely end this story in legal and narrative terms, roughly where they began it, without adequate institutional recognition of what was done to them. That is not justice. It might be law, but it is not justice. I'm Harrison Cross. This is the Blackout Tapes. The case from Canindé does not have a clean ending, at least not one I can give you. The judicial proceeding is ongoing or concluded in silence. The daughter has no documented voice in any source I reviewed. The man whose alleged conduct set everything in motion does not appear, in the public record, to have faced charges for that conduct. And a city of 74,000 people, a pilgrimage city, a place most people associate with faith and community, is reduced in the accounts that circulate online to a backdrop for someone else's idea of horror. The shot that missed its mark was not the bullet. It was the investigation that looked at what happened on June 29th and asked who ordered it, but not what had been ordered in silence for much longer inside that house. If you have documents, records, or first-hand knowledge related to this case or to similar cases involving the intersection of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and criminal proceedings in Brazil's interior municipalities, I want to hear from you. The address is in the show notes. There is more to this story. There almost always is.